The scene opens in a packed New York City studio where the energy is electric. The bright lights of late-night television cast a warm glow over the audience, who are eagerly waiting for the show to begin. It's one of those nights that feels special even before anything happens, like everyone knows something big is about to go down. The host walks onto the stage, waving to the cheering crowd, and introduces the first guest, Jon Stewart. Now, if you don't know who Jon Stewart is, let me break it down for you. He's not just some comedian, he's the comedian. For years he hosted The Daily Show, turning political commentary into an art form. His sharp jokes and quick wit have made him a legend. Tonight, though, he's here as a guest on another popular talk show, and the audience can barely contain their excitement. They're ready for his signature humor, his ability to cut through nonsense with a single punchline. And sure enough, as soon as he sits down, he doesn't disappoint. Jon starts off with his usual charm, cracking jokes about everything under the sun. Politicians, celebrities, current events. Every line lands perfectly, earning roars of laughter from the crowd. You can tell he's in his element, completely at ease behind that desk. But then comes the moment everyone's been waiting for, the introduction of the next guest. The host turns to the camera and says, "Our next guest needs no introduction, but I'll give her one anyway. She's a rising star in the world of politics, known for speaking her mind and stirring up debates. Please welcome Caroline Leavitt." As Caroline walks out, there's polite applause. She looks calm, confident, and maybe just a little nervous. After all, this isn't just any interview. It's a showdown with Jon Stewart. If you've ever seen him on TV, you know he doesn't pull punches. He's the kind of guy who can make anyone squirm with a single, well-timed joke. So when Caroline takes her seat across from him, the tension in the room is palpable. Everyone's wondering, how will she hold up against someone like Jon? At first, things seem fine. The host asks a few light questions, and Caroline answers smoothly. She talks about her background, how she got into politics, and what drives her passion for public service. Her voice is steady, her words thoughtful. But then, Jon leans forward, his trademark smirk creeping across his face. "So," he says, drawing out the word for dramatic effect, "you're the new voice of reason, huh? Or at least what passes for reason these days." The comment gets a chuckle from the audience, but it also sets the tone for what's coming next. Jon doesn't waste any time. He dives right in, firing off one sarcastic remark after another. He jokes about how quickly Caroline has risen to fame, implying that she might be riding on luck rather than skill. "It's almost like you showed up one day and decided, 'Hey, why not try politics?'" he says, raising an eyebrow. The audience laughs, but you can see a flicker of discomfort in Caroline's eyes. Still, she keeps smiling, nodding along as if to say, "Go ahead, bring it on." What makes this moment so compelling isn't just the fact that Jon is trying to rattle her, it's the way Caroline handles herself. Instead of looking flustered or defensive, she leans back slightly in her chair, giving off an air of quiet confidence. She listens carefully to every word Jon says, processing it before responding. It's clear she's not going to let him get the better of her without putting up a fight. And while the audience enjoys the banter, they can't help but wonder, is Caroline really as unshaken as she appears? Or is she just biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back? Meanwhile, the cameras zoom in on Jon's face, capturing every twitch of his lips and gleam in his eye. He seems to be enjoying himself, clearly relishing the challenge of taking on someone as outspoken as Caroline. For him, this is more than just entertainment. It's a game, and he plays to win. But as the segment progresses, you start to notice something interesting. Beneath the jokes and jabs, there's a hint of curiosity in Jon's demeanor, as if he's genuinely intrigued by Caroline's composure. Maybe he didn't expect her to handle his teasing so gracefully. Or maybe he's starting to realize that this young woman sitting across from him is not your average opponent. Back in the audience, people are leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Some are laughing at Jon's jokes, while others are silently rooting for Caroline to turn the tables. There's a sense that something big is about to happen, that this exchange is building toward a climax. Will Caroline crumble under the pressure? Or will she find a way to stand her ground and prove that she's more than just a target for John's humor? As the conversation continues, the stakes grow higher. Each remark from John feels like a test, pushing Caroline to see how far she'll go to defend herself. But instead of shrinking away, she seems to grow stronger with each passing minute. Her body language shifts subtly. She sits up straighter, her gaze steadier. It's as if she's gathering her strength, preparing for the moment when she'll finally speak her piece. And when that moment comes, it's bound to be unforgettable. This isn't just a battle of wits anymore. It's a clash of personalities, values, and perspectives. On one side, you have John, the seasoned veteran with decades of experience in satire and storytelling. On the other, there's Caroline, the newcomer determined to carve out her place in the world. Their interaction captures the essence of what makes live TV so captivating: the unpredictability, the raw emotion, and the sheer thrill of watching two strong voices collide. Whatever happens next, one thing is certain: it's going to leave a lasting impression on everyone watching. The courtroom was buzzing with energy, the kind that makes you feel like you're sitting in the middle of a storm. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, cameras clicked softly from the corners, and whispers bounced off the walls. Everyone was waiting for the judge to speak. At the center of it all sat a man whose life had become the talk of the town, Bondi. He wasn't just any ordinary guy. He was a local businessman who'd made headlines for something he said, or rather shouted. It all started a few weeks ago when Bondi attended a public rally. The event itself was nothing unusual, a gathering of people discussing politics, policies, and everything in between. But then Bondi stepped up to the microphone, his face red with emotion, and let loose a string of insults aimed directly at President Joe Biden. His words were sharp, loud, and unfiltered. They weren't just critical, they were personal, raw, and laced with anger. Within hours, videos of his rant went viral online. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some defended him, saying he had every right to express his views. Others called him reckless, accusing him of crossing a line no one should ever cross. Now here he was, sitting in court, staring at the judge with a mix of defiance and fear. Judge Leavitt, known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach, adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. His eyes landed on Bondi, and for a moment there was silence. You could almost hear the tension crackling in the air. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "This case isn't about politics," he began, leaning forward slightly. "It's about respect, for our leaders, for this country, and for the rule of law." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room felt heavier now, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then, without missing a beat, Judge Leavitt delivered his verdict. "Mr. Bondi, your comments were not only disrespectful but also dangerous. You've shown contempt for the office of the presidency, and I cannot allow such behavior to go unpunished." With that, he announced the fine, $100,000. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others nodded in approval. Bondi's face turned pale. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but Bondi didn't respond. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. For a moment, it seemed like the drama might end there. The judge prepared to adjourn the session, lifting his gavel to bring the proceedings to a close. But then, something unexpected happened, something that would make this case unforgettable. 7 minutes after the verdict, Bondi suddenly stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, breaking the quiet murmur of the courtroom. All eyes turned to him as he pointed a finger directly at Judge Leavitt. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "This is ridiculous. You're punishing me because you can't handle the truth." The gallery erupted into murmurs. Security guards moved quickly toward him, but Bondi wasn't done. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged forward, grabbing the railing of the witness box and shaking it violently. "You're all puppets," he yelled, his voice echoing through the room. Spit flew from his mouth as he continued his tirade. "Puppets of the system." The bailiff rushed to restrain him, but Bondi fought back, thrashing wildly. It took several officers to finally subdue him. pinning him down as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Judge Leavitt watched the scene unfold with a look of icy calm. When the commotion settled, he raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Take him out of here," he ordered, his tone cold and final. As Bondi was dragged away, still shouting obscenities, the crowd erupted once again. Some clapped quietly, approving of the judge's decision, while others looked on in shock. Outside the courthouse, news vans scrambled to capture footage of the chaos, knowing they had stumbled upon a story that would dominate headlines for days to come. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, conversations about the case spread, like wildfire. Social media lit up with reactions. Memes, hashtags, and heated debates flooded platforms, turning Bondi's name into a symbol of controversy. Late-night comedians joked about the $100,000 fine and Bondi's dramatic outburst, adding fuel to the fire. Supporters rallied behind him, calling him a champion of free speech. Critics branded him a loose cannon, someone who needed to learn respect. And somewhere in the middle, Judge Leavitt found himself caught in a whirlwind of praise and criticism, his reputation hanging precariously in the balance. As the days passed, the story grew bigger, more complicated, and far more personal. For Bondi, it became a fight not just for justice but for identity. For Judge Leavitt, it was a test of principles and resolve. And for everyone watching, it was a mirror reflecting the complexities of modern society, a place where freedom, responsibility, and consequences collide in ways no one can predict. The courtroom was tense as the appeal hearing began. It felt like the air itself was charged with electricity, every breath heavier than the last. Lawyers on both sides shuffled papers, their faces masks of determination. Bondi sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. He looked exhausted but resolute, his eyes darting between his lawyer and the panel of judges who would decide his fate. Across the room, representatives from the prosecution stood poised, ready to defend Judge Leavitt's original ruling. Everyone knew this was the moment that could change everything or settle nothing at all. Bondi's lawyer stepped forward first, his voice steady but impassioned. "Your Honors," he began, addressing the judges directly, "this case is not about one man's words or actions. It's about something far greater, the very foundation of free expression in our society." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "My client voiced an opinion, perhaps harsh, perhaps controversial, but isn't that what free speech is meant to protect? Ideas we disagree with, statements that make us uncomfortable, they're part of the fabric of democracy. If we punish people for speaking their minds, where does it end?" He gestured toward Bondi, who nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Yes, my client made mistakes. Yes, his language was inflammatory. But silencing him sets a dangerous precedent. Are we saying that only certain opinions are allowed? That dissent comes with a price tag? If so, then we've strayed dangerously far from the principles this country was built upon. The crowd murmured softly, some nodding along while others frowned in disagreement. The prosecution team exchanged glances, knowing they had their work cut out for them. When it was their turn to speak, their lead attorney rose confidently, her tone calm but firm. "Respectfully, Your Honors," she started, "this case isn't about stifling free speech. It's about accountability. Freedom of expression doesn't mean freedom from consequences. What my opposing counsel fails to acknowledge is the impact of those words. Words have power. They can hurt, divide, and incite. And when someone uses that power irresponsibly, there must be repercussions." She turned slightly, pointing toward Bondi without looking directly at him. "This isn't just about criticizing leadership. This is about crossing a line, using derogatory language, spreading falsehoods, and showing blatant disrespect for an institution that represents millions of citizens. We cannot allow such behavior to go unchecked. Doing so undermines trust, civility, and the values we strive to uphold." Her argument struck a chord with many in the room. Some attendees nodded approvingly, whispering to each other about how she'd hit the nail on the head. Others shifted uncomfortably, uneasy with the idea of punishing someone for voicing their beliefs, however extreme. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker, almost palpable, as the judges listened intently, their expressions neutral, but thoughtful. As the day wore on, witnesses took the stand, offering testimony that painted conflicting pictures of Bondi. A local activist described him as a passionate advocate for transparency and truth, someone unafraid to challenge authority. He may not always choose his words wisely, the activist admitted, but he speaks from the heart. Isn't that what we want more of in public discourse? On the flip side, a community leader recounted how Bondi's comments had sparked division and hostility in their town. His words weren't just offensive, they were harmful, the leader said firmly. They created rifts where none existed before. That kind of damage can't be ignored. Each side presented compelling arguments, weaving narratives that pulled at different emotions. By the time closing statements rolled around, the atmosphere was electric. Bondi's lawyer delivered a final plea, urging the judges to see beyond the controversy and focus on the bigger picture. If we silence voices like my clients, he warned, we risk creating a culture of fear, a world where people are too scared to speak up even when it matters most. His words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. The prosecution countered with equal fervor, emphasizing the importance of balance. Freedom comes with responsibility, the attorney reminded the court. We cannot claim to value civility and respect while excusing behavior that tears at the seams of our society. There must be limits, and today we ask you to enforce them. Her final statement hung in the silence, leaving everyone to ponder its implications. When the session finally adjourned, the courtroom erupted into quiet chatter. People filed out slowly, exchanging thoughts and predictions. Outside, reporters swarmed the exits, microphones thrust forward in hopes of catching a comment from anyone involved. Bondi emerged last, flanked by his legal team. He stopped briefly to address the cameras, his voice hoarse but unwavering. I won't back down, he declared. No matter what happens next, I'll keep fighting. For justice, for truth, and for the right to speak freely. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Back inside, the judges retreated to deliberate, their faces betraying no hint of what they might decide. Hours passed, then days, as the nation waited anxiously for their ruling. Social media buzzed with speculation, hashtags trending daily. Supporters rallied outside courthouses across the country, holding signs that read, "Free speech is sacred," and "Hold leaders accountable." Critics organized counter-protests, arguing that respect and accountability should take precedence over unchecked expression. For Bondi, the wait was agonizing. He spent hours pacing his living room, replaying the trial in his mind. His wife tried to comfort him, but her own anxiety was evident. What if they don't see it our way? She asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Bondi sighed, running a hand through his hair. Then we fight harder, he replied. This isn't just about me, it's about setting a precedent. If I give up now, what message does that send? Meanwhile, Judge Leavitt watched the unfolding drama from afar, his thoughts private but no less complex. Friends noticed he seemed quieter these days, lost in reflection. One evening, over dinner with a colleague, he mused aloud. Do you ever wonder if the decisions we make truly serve justice? Or if they just reflect the times we live in? His friend didn't answer immediately, instead raising a glass in silent solidarity. Both men understood the burden of judgment, the delicate dance between principle and pragmatism. As the weeks dragged on, anticipation reached a fever pitch. News outlets ran countdowns to the verdict, analysts debated endlessly, and communities braced themselves for whatever came next. For better or worse, the outcome would shape not only Bondi's life, but also the broader conversation about freedom, responsibility, and the fragile balance between the two. Whatever the decision, one thing was clear. This story wasn't just about one man, it was about all of us. The day of the verdict finally arrived, and it felt like the entire nation was holding its breath. The courtroom was packed once again, reporters with their notepads ready, cameras rolling silently in the corners, and spectators craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what would happen next. Bondi sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, his face a mix of hope and dread. His lawyer leaned over occasionally to whisper reassurances, but Bondi barely responded. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the panel of judges who held his fate in their hands. Judge Leavitt wasn't present this time. The appeal was being heard by a higher court. Still, his shadow loomed large over the proceedings. The judges entered the room, their expressions unreadable, and the crowd fell silent. One of them, an older man with silver hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose, cleared his throat before speaking. After careful consideration of the arguments presented, he began, his voice calm but authoritative. "We have reached our decision." For a moment the world seemed to stop. No one moved, no one spoke. Then the judge continued. "We affirm the lower court's ruling that the fine imposed on the defendant is justified. However, we find the original sentence of imprisonment excessive given the circumstances. In lieu of jail time, the defendant will serve 200 hours of community service." The room erupted into chaos. Supporters cheered loudly, some even standing up to applaud, while critics shook their heads in frustration. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions, their pens flying across notebooks. Bondi exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly as if a weight had been lifted, but only partially. A $100,000 fine was still a staggering amount, and the community service requirement meant months of unpaid labor. Yet, there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. He hadn't lost completely. Turning to his lawyer, he muttered under his breath, "It's not over yet." His lawyer nodded grimly, already thinking about the next steps. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, chanting slogans and waving signs. "This isn't justice," one man shouted into a megaphone. "They're trying to silence us." Others echoed his words, their voices rising in unison. Critics, too, were quick to react. A woman standing near the edge of the crowd held up a sign that read, "Accountability Matters." She addressed a small group of reporters, her tone firm but measured. "I'm glad they upheld the fine," she said. "What he did wasn't just free speech, it was reckless and harmful. We can't let people think they can say whatever they want without consequences." Her statement drew nods of agreement from those around her, though a few hecklers in the background booed loudly. As news of the verdict spread, social media exploded. Hashtags like "Justice for All" and "Respect to BV's Freedom" trended side by side, reflecting the deep divisions the case had exposed. Late-night talk show hosts joked about the outcome, turning Bondi's plight into comedic fodder. "Looks like Bondi got off easy," quipped one host, grinning at the camera. "At least he doesn't have to wear an orange jumpsuit, but 200 hours of picking up trash, that's gotta sting." The audience laughed, but beneath the humor lay a more serious question. What does this ruling mean for free speech in the future? For Bondi, life became a whirlwind of activity. He threw himself into planning his appeal strategy, determined to take the case all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. "They may have won this round," he told supporters during a rally, his voice filled with defiance. "But I won't stop fighting, not until my rights and yours are protected." The crowd roared in approval, many raising their fists in solidarity. It was clear that Bondi had become more than just a man embroiled in a legal battle. He had become a symbol of resistance, for some and a cautionary tale for others. His wife, meanwhile, struggled to keep things together behind the scenes. Friends noticed she looked thinner, her usual warmth replaced by a quiet exhaustion. During interviews, she tried to remain optimistic, but cracks began to show. "We're doing our best," she told a reporter, forcing a smile. "But it's hard. Every day feels like another hurdle, another challenge. Sometimes I wonder if it'll ever end." Her vulnerability struck a chord with many viewers, humanizing the story in ways the courtroom drama couldn't. Judge Leavitt, too, found himself grappling with the aftermath. Though he wasn't directly involved in the appeals process, his initial ruling remained a focal point of discussion. Supporters praised him for standing firm, calling him a pillar of integrity. Critics accused him of overstepping, arguing that his decision reflected bias rather than impartiality. Anonymous threats continued to trickle in, forcing him to increase security measures both at home and in the courthouse. Friends described him as stoic but weary, carrying the burden of public scrutiny with quiet dignity. In private moments, Judge Leavitt allowed himself to reflect on the case. Sitting in his study one evening, a glass of water in hand, he stared out the window at the darkened sky. "Do you ever feel like you've done everything right?" he asked his wife, who sat knitting nearby. "But the world still sees you as the villain?" She looked up, her needles pausing mid-stitch. "You followed the law," she replied softly. "That's all anyone can ask of you." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe. But sometimes following the law doesn't feel like enough." As weeks turned into months, the story continued to evolve. Bondi's legal team filed motions, seeking to overturn the ruling or at least reduce the fine. They argued that the financial penalty was disproportionate and punitive, designed to silence dissent rather than promote accountability. Meanwhile, Bondi became a fixture at rallies and protests, using his platform to speak out against what he called government overreach. His speeches grew more polished, his delivery sharper as he learned to navigate the spotlight. Some admired his resilience, while others dismissed him as attention-seeking. Supporters rallied around him, organizing fundraisers to help cover the $100,000 fine. Donations poured in from across the country, though they were far from enough to meet the full amount. Critics seized on this, accusing Bondi of exploiting the situation for personal gain. "He claims he's fighting for free speech," one critic wrote in an op-ed. "But how much of this is really about his ego? If he cared so much about principles, why is he begging strangers to pay his fines?" The accusation stung, fueling debates about sincerity versus opportunism. Through it all, the nation remained divided. Talk shows invited experts to weigh in. Schools debated the case in classrooms, and dinner tables buzzed with heated discussions. Was Bondi a martyr for free expression, or a loose cannon who needed to be reined in? Should Judge Leavitt be celebrated for upholding respect, or criticized for stifling dissent? There were no easy answers, only layers of complexity that mirrored the challenges facing modern society. By the time winter rolled around, the case had taken on a life of its own. Documentaries began production, exploring every angle of the controversy. Journalists dug deeper, uncovering details about Bondi's past, Judge Leavitt's career, and the broader implications of the ruling. For better or worse, the story refused to fade away. It lingered in the collective consciousness, a reminder of the delicate balance between freedom and responsibility, individual rights and societal norms. And yet, amidst the noise and chaos, one thing remained clear. This wasn't just Bondi's fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who cared about the future of free expression, accountability, and justice. Whatever happened next, the ripple effects would be felt for years to come. Months passed, and the story of Bondi and Judge Leavitt continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The initial shock of the verdict had faded, but the ripple effects were far from over. For Bondi, life became a strange mix of chaos and routine. Every morning he woke up early, dressed in simple clothes, and headed out to fulfill his community service hours. Whether it was cleaning parks, painting fences at local schools, or helping out at food banks, he threw himself into the work with surprising dedication. Some days, cameras followed him, capturing footage for news segments or documentaries. Other times, he worked quietly, avoiding attention as much as possible. At first, people weren't sure what to make of this new side of Bondi. Supporters saw it as proof of his commitment, not just to his cause, but to giving back to the community. "Look at him," one supporter said during an interview outside a park where Bondi was picking up trash. "He's not sitting around feeling sorry for himself. He's out here working hard, showing us that he cares." Critics, however, remained skeptical. "Community service is supposed to be punishment, not PR," muttered a man watching the same scene from a distance. "It feels like he's turning this whole thing into some kind of publicity stunt." Despite the mixed reactions, Bondi seemed determined to prove something, not just to others but to himself. During breaks, he often sat alone on a bench eating a sandwich or sipping water from a bottle. Occasionally, curious passersby would approach him, asking questions or offering words of encouragement. Most of the time, he responded politely, though there was always a hint of weariness in his voice. "I know a lot of people don't understand why I'm doing this," he admitted to a volunteer coordinator one afternoon. "But I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it because I believe in standing by my principles even when it's hard." Meanwhile, Judge Leavitt began to step back from the public eye. The stress of the case had taken its toll, and friends noticed he seemed quieter, more introspective. Rumors circulated that he might retire early, though no official announcement had been made. One evening, while walking his dog through a quiet neighborhood park, he ran into a former colleague who stopped to chat. "How are you holding up?" the colleague asked gently. Judge Leavitt shrugged, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "Some days are better than others," he replied. "But I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. What do we leave behind after all these years of trying to do the right thing?" The conversation stayed with him long after they parted ways. That night, sitting in his favorite armchair with a cup of tea, Judge Leavitt flipped through old case files, reminiscing about decisions he'd made over the years. Some had been celebrated, others had sparked controversy. But this latest case felt different, more personal somehow. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about the impact those laws had on real people, real lives. He found himself wondering if there was ever a perfect answer, a way to balance justice and compassion without leaving anyone feeling wronged. As winter gave way to spring, Bondi's legal battle dragged on. His team filed yet another appeal, arguing that the $100,000 fine was excessive and violated constitutional rights. They cited examples of similar cases where fines had been significantly lower, hoping to sway higher courts to reconsider. Meanwhile, Bondi kept speaking out, attending rallies and giving interviews whenever he could. His speeches grew more polished, his arguments more refined, but the passion behind them never wavered. "This isn't just about me," he told a packed auditorium one evening. "It's about protecting the freedoms we all cherish. If they can silence one voice, they can silence any voice." His message resonated with many, drawing larger crowds to his events. Yet not everyone was convinced. Critics accused him of exploiting the situation for fame, pointing to the growing number of merchandise sales featuring slogans like "Free Speech Warrior" or "Stand With Me." Others questioned whether his actions truly aligned with the values he claimed to represent. "He talks a big game about truth and accountability," a commentator noted on a popular talk show. "But has he really shown either? Or is this just about feeding his ego?" Amidst the noise, Bondi's family struggled to adapt. His wife tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, keeping their home running smoothly despite the constant media attention. She avoided interviews now, focusing instead on supporting her husband in private. Friends described her as resilient but weary, carrying the emotional weight of the situation with quiet strength. Their children, too, bore the brunt of the spotlight. At school, classmates whispered about them, sometimes teasing or asking intrusive questions. "Mom says we should ignore it," one of the kids confided to a teacher. "But it's hard when everyone knows your name." Back in the courtroom, the appeals process moved slowly, each hearing bringing fresh waves of anticipation and frustration. Lawyers argued passionately, judges deliberated carefully, and spectators waited anxiously for updates. Outside, protests continued, with supporters and critics clashing over the meaning of free speech and respect. Social media buzzed with hashtags and memes, turning the case into both a cultural phenomenon and a battleground for ideas. For Judge Leavitt, the pressure mounted. Calls for his removal from the bench grew louder, fueled by critics who accused him of bias. Supporters rallied to defend him, praising his integrity and dedication to upholding the law. Late-night comedians joked about the controversy, poking fun at both sides while highlighting the absurdity of the divide. "You know things are bad," one host quipped, "when even the judge needs a bodyguard just to walk his dog." Yet, amidst the chaos, moments of humanity emerged. A young woman attending one of Bondi's rallies approached him after his speech, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching his hand tightly. "Your fight gives me hope." Bondi nodded, patting her shoulder awkwardly before moving on. Later, someone shared the moment online and it went viral, a reminder that beneath the politics and rhetoric, real emotions were at play. As summer approached, the nation braced itself for the next chapter in the saga. Would the Supreme Court take up the case? Would Bondi finally get the vindication he sought, or face further setbacks? And what about Judge Leavitt? Would he step away from the bench, leaving behind a career defined by controversy, or dig in his heels and continue serving? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. This story wasn't ending anytime soon. It had become more than a legal drama. It was a reflection of the challenges facing society, a mirror held up to reveal the complexities of freedom, responsibility, and the human spirit. By the time summer rolled around, the case had become a part of the cultural fabric, woven into everyday conversations and debates. It wasn't just about Bondi or Judge Leavitt anymore. It was about what their story represented. For some, it symbolized the fight for free expression in an increasingly polarized world. For others, it stood as a cautionary tale about the consequences of crossing lines that society deemed sacred. And for many, it was simply a reminder of how messy and complicated life could be when principles collided with reality. Bondi's days were filled with a strange rhythm. Mornings began with community service, painting over graffiti on walls, picking up litter from streets, or helping elderly neighbors with yard work. He didn't complain, though the physical labor left him exhausted by mid-afternoon. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of himself on TV during breaks, his face appearing in news segments or talk shows discussing the latest developments in his case. Watching those clips felt surreal, like seeing a version of himself that wasn't entirely real. "It's weird," he admitted to a fellow volunteer one day while stacking boxes at a food bank. "You get used to being this character people talk about, but inside you're still just trying to figure things out." His evenings were quieter, spent mostly at home with his family. His wife tried to keep meals light and cheerful, steering clear of heavy topics unless Bondi brought them up first. The kids, sensing the tension, tiptoed around certain subjects but occasionally blurted out questions they'd been holding back. "Dad, are you famous now?" one of them asked one night, over dinner. Bondi chuckled, ruffling the child's hair. "Not exactly," he replied, "but I guess some people know who I am." His tone was lighthearted, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Fame, if you could call it that, hadn't brought him happiness. It had only deepened the cracks in his life. Judge Leavitt, on the other hand, seemed to retreat further into solitude. Friends noticed he avoided public gatherings, preferring long walks alone or quiet nights reading by the fireplace. One Saturday morning, while browsing through a bookstore, he stumbled upon a magazine article titled, "The Man Who Fined Free Speech." The headline stung, even though he'd grown accustomed to criticism. Flipping through the pages, he found quotes from both supporters and detractors, each dissecting his decision with surgical precision. Some praised him for standing firm. Others accused him of arrogance. He closed the magazine abruptly, placing it back on the shelf without buying it. That evening, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, he reflected on the toll the case had taken, not just on him but on everyone involved. "Do you ever wonder," he asked his wife, who sat knitting nearby, "if we're all just pieces in someone else's game? Like none of us really have control over what happens next?" She looked up, her needles pausing mid-stitch. "I think we do our best," she said softly. "And sometimes, that's enough." Her words offered little comfort, but they stayed with him, lingering like the last notes of a song. Meanwhile, Bondi's legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, filing briefs and preparing arguments for yet another appeal. They knew the odds weren't in their favor. The higher courts rarely overturned decisions like this, but they refused to give up. "We're not fighting just for you," his lead attorney told him during a strategy meeting. "We're fighting for something bigger. If we win, it sets a precedent. If we lose, well, we'll deal with that when it comes." Bondi nodded, though doubt lingered in his expression. He wanted to believe they could change the outcome, but after months of setbacks, optimism felt harder to hold on to. Outside the legal battle, the public discourse raged on. Documentaries began airing, offering different perspectives on the case. One filmmaker focused on Bondi, portraying him as a misunderstood advocate for free speech. Another highlighted Judge Leavitt, framing him as a principled man caught in an impossible situation. Both films sparked heated discussions with viewers taking sides based on their own beliefs. Late-night hosts joked about the dueling documentaries, quipping, "At this rate, we'll need a documentary about the documentaries." Social media remained a battleground, with hashtags trending daily. Supporters rallied under banners like, "Sur Freedom Fights Back," organizing events and fundraisers to support Bondi's cause. Critics countered with campaigns like Wingerton Respect Matters, urging people to focus on civility and accountability. The divide between the two camps grew wider, fueled by algorithms that amplified outrage and division. Yet, amidst the noise, there were moments of connection. A viral video showed a protester and a counter-protester sitting together on a park bench, sharing a laugh despite their opposing views. "We might not agree," one of them said, smiling, "but at least we can still talk." As the weeks turned into months, the case reached a tipping point. Rumors swirled that the Supreme Court might take it up, though nothing was confirmed. In the meantime, Bondi continued his routine, balancing community service with media appearances. At one rally, a young woman approached him after his speech, tears streaming down her face. "You've given me hope," she whispered, clutching his hand tightly. Bondi patted her shoulder awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Later, someone shared the moment online, and it resonated deeply, reminding people of the human side of the story. For Judge Leavitt, the weight of the case finally became too much. After months of deliberation, he announced his retirement from the bench. "I've served this country to the best of my ability," he wrote in a brief statement. "But it's time for me to step aside and let others carry the torch." The announcement drew mixed reactions. Supporters hailed him as a hero, praising his integrity and dedication. Critics dismissed it as an admission of guilt, accusing him of running away from accountability. Through it all, Judge Leavitt remained silent, choosing instead to spend his final days reflecting on a career defined by both triumphs and controversies. And so, as autumn approached, the nation waited anxiously for the next chapter. Would the Supreme Court intervene? Would Bondi find vindication or face further punishment? And what legacy would Judge Leavitt leave behind? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. This story wasn't just about laws and rulings. It was about people, flawed, passionate, and searching for meaning in a world that often felt divided. Whatever happened next, it would shape not only their lives, but also the broader conversation about freedom, responsibility, and the fragile balance between the two. The months rolled on, and the story of Bondi and Judge Leavitt reached its inevitable crossroads. The Supreme Court had made its decision. They would not hear the case. It was a blow to Bondi and his legal team, who had pinned their hopes on this final appeal. When the news broke, Bondi sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the official statement on his laptop screen. His wife walked in quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly, though her voice betrayed her own disappointment. Bondi didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and let out a long sigh. "This isn't how I thought it would end," he admitted after a moment, his voice heavy with resignation. His wife nodded, sitting down beside him. "I know," she replied, "but maybe this is where it begins." Her words hung in the air, uncertain but full of quiet hope. For weeks afterward, Bondi wrestled with the verdict. He felt defeated, angry even, but something inside him refused to give up entirely. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never really had been. People across the country still looked to him as a symbol of defiance against perceived injustice. Whether he liked it or not, he had become part of a larger conversation about freedom, accountability, and the limits of expression. In the days that followed, Bondi shifted his focus. Instead of dwelling on what he couldn't change, he threw himself into finishing his community service hours. He worked harder than ever, showing up early and staying late, determined to leave a positive mark wherever he went. At one park cleanup event, a group of teenagers joined him, inspired by his persistence. "Why do you keep doing this?" one of them asked during a break. Bondi smiled faintly, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because sometimes when you can't win the fight, you have to find another way to make things better," he said. The kids exchanged glances, unsure if they fully understood, but they nodded anyway. Later that evening, someone snapped a photo of Bondi laughing with the teens, and it went viral, a rare moment of levity in an otherwise tense saga. Meanwhile, Judge Leavitt settled into retirement, though it wasn't the peaceful escape he'd imagined. Friends noticed he spent hours reading books about philosophy and law, searching for answers to questions that had haunted him since the trial. One afternoon, while tending to his garden, he received a letter from a stranger. Inside was a handwritten note thanking him for standing firm even in the face of criticism. "You reminded me that justice isn't always popular, but it's always necessary," the writer concluded. Judge Leavitt read the note several times, feeling a lump form in his throat. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of peace. As winter approached, the nation began reflecting on the case in hindsight. Documentaries aired, offering fresh perspectives on the events that had unfolded. One filmmaker interviewed both Bondi and Judge Leavitt separately, capturing their thoughts years later. Bondi spoke candidly about his regrets and triumphs, admitting that while he stood by his beliefs, he wished he'd chosen his words more carefully. "I learned the hard way that freedom comes with responsibility," he said during the interview. "You can speak your mind, but you also have to live with the consequences." Judge Leavitt, too, shared his reflections, acknowledging the weight of his decision. "I did what I believed was right," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But I'll carry the burden of knowing I hurt people along the way." The film resonated deeply, sparking renewed discussions about the balance between free speech and respect. Schools incorporated it into lesson plans, using it as a starting point for debates about modern democracy. Social media lit up once again, with hashtags like #KwashaLessonsLearned trending alongside clips from the documentary. Late-night hosts joked about the irony of two men becoming lifelong symbols of opposing ideals, only to admit, years later, that they weren't so different after. All years passed, and the story faded from headlines, though it remained etched in collective memory. Bondi eventually returned to his business, quieter but wiser. He continued speaking at events, though his tone softened over time. He no longer sought to provoke. Instead, he aimed to inspire. "We don't have to agree on everything," he often said during speeches, "but we do have to agree to listen, to each other, to our differences, and to the values that bind us together." Judge Leavitt lived out his days in relative obscurity, finding solace in gardening and writing. Occasionally, he gave lectures at local universities, sharing insights from his career without mentioning the infamous case. Yet students inevitably brought it up during Q&A sessions, curious about his perspective. "What would I do differently?" he mused aloud during one such session. "Maybe nothing, or maybe everything. But I think the real question is, what will you do when faced with a difficult choice?" By the time Bondi's children were grown, the world had changed dramatically. Technology advanced, politics shifted, and new debates emerged. Still, the lessons from their father's ordeal lingered. They carried those lessons forward, teaching their own kids about the importance of standing up for what they believed in, while remembering the cost of crossing lines others held sacred. And so, the story of Bondi and Judge Leavitt became more than a tale of conflict. It became a mirror reflecting humanity's struggles, the tension between individual rights and societal norms, the courage to speak out, and the humility to reflect. It reminded everyone that justice isn't black and white but shades of gray, and that every decision carries ripples far beyond the moment it's made.